Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So on Monday, just a couple days after Spain was congratulating itself for going full net zero, there was a major blackout, major power outages in Spain and Portugal and parts of France. And, of course, the immediate reaction from the Western press to the power outages, leaving people stranded on trains in the countryside and elevators and darkness descending. It was the immediate reaction from the press corps was, of course, to defend the energy ideologues.
Of course.
For example, Reuters, the Reuters story, don't blame renewables for Spain's power outage. The second sentence of that story,
right,
quoting, the issue appears to be the management of renewables in the modern grid. So, yes, it's not renewable energy, solar and wind in and of themselves, but you have to look at it holistically with respect to the system. And apparently, over a couple of decades, the eco-supremacists have made a series of policy decisions that made the grid increasingly vulnerable for a weather event or some other challenge to the system. Because initially the report was there was some anomalous weather event. Yeah, well, that may well be, but those sorts of contingencies are supposed to be plotted out by engineers to make sure that electricity grids are not compromised by anomalous weather events, for example. And the Wall Street Journal opining on this, the part of the issue is, and we'll get into this with Mark Mills, who has much more expertise than I do, the greater the share of renewables vis-a-vis conventional power plants with synchronous turbines, the less inertia there is to cushion instantaneous load fluctuations in the grid, meaning the system becomes more fragile and there's higher risk of failure, more fragile to something like an anomalous weather event. So you could say it's an anomalous weather event. It wasn't the fact that they're so reliant on renewable energies, but then you have to look at what renewables demand of the grid and how you're managing the component parts of the grid. Spain's near record percentage of solar energy production was accompanied by a smaller amount of wind, neither of which are capable of stabilizing the system if needed. The grid was also running with a low share of turbine-based generation, around 30%. Low inertia meant playing with fire, or more accurately with the sun, given that Spain's policymakers minimized thermal generation. And also, it's worth noting just explicitly, they, like Germany, they moved away from safe and reliable nuclear power as well, because they're ideologues. It's a socialist government. And then the president of Spain comes out and blames private industry somehow. Mm-hmm. Of course they do. Got to redirect. Well, let's get to some expertise on the topic. We're pleased now to be joined by Mark Mills, who is the founder and executive director of the National Center for Energy Analytics. Mark, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
It's good to join you this morning.
So your perspective on this these power failures in Western Europe.
Well, you did a great job summarizing it. You are an expert.
Well,
good.
Congratulations, Dan.
Yeah.
It's really good. Now, look, this was, the phrase, and it's true in this case, this was predictable and predicted. And apparently the Spanish utility did warn the financial regulators in Spain, words to the effect will damage our reputation because we're walking on the edge of unreliability and major outages. And you put it exactly correctly. It's the fragility of the grid, the stability with which you can keep the lights on. It seems strange because you look at power lines and poles and you think, it looks pretty solid, right? They're just carrying electricity. It's one of the signature accomplishments of the last 1.5 centuries has been creating these grids of astonishingly reliable electric power. Electricity doesn't flow like water. It's a very strange phenomenon, and keeping the system stable, as you put it. Everybody talks in the technical press and popular press about inertia, Of course, it's a misuse of the phrase. Inertia is like a big ship is more stable than a small ship. I mean, that's inertia, right? It's hard to move and big mass. It's strictly speaking, that's not what it is. It's a better analogy would be that keeping electricity stable is like the kid's game of a cookie sheet with water in it and walking with it without spilling it, and then you're told you have to run. It's hard to do. Right? You can do it, but it's hard. Grids are like that, and what's called non-dispatchable wind and solar. It's not just they don't just have inertia. Is that if you have any hiccups, you can't suddenly call on lots of extra power, and also the power that's so-called stable. Like this is, it has this feature we're calling inertia. Anyway, that's a rephrasing of what you said. The bottom line is that the grid operators, the utilities themselves, the engineers are terrific everywhere in the world, by the way. I've met with many of these utility engineers. They do a spectacular job, despite being ordered politically in many U.S. states and many countries to keep doing things that are antithetical to reliability. And then they warn their overlords that this is hard to do. This was predicted, as I said, by them. It's being predicted, incidentally, by our North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is job is to look at U.S. grids and point out each year where fragility exists. And the latest report from them has been issuing the same kind of warnings to various parts of the United States that the Spanish utility operator sent to their financial regulators. So we're on the same track here in a number of states, and let's hope the lesson gets learned.
Are we on the same track in those areas for the same reasons that Spain and Portugal were?
Exactly the same reasons, by subsidizing or requiring, we'll call it the overuse of wind and solar. You can use a lot of wind and solar on grids. The amount you can use it varies technically depending on the kind of grid, where it is. It's like anything else in life, right? There's variables. But what you can't do is make it almost all wind and solar and expect it to be reliable. South Australia had a similar outage a number of years ago for the same reason, too much wind. There was a wind lull. The system was not resilient, and instead of accommodating it and bringing it on back up, the whole grid collapsed. And you can add batteries. You'll hear a lot of talk about, we can add batteries. Yes, you can. They help. They help. You can add more control systems, smarter grids. Sure, you can. That helps. And in fact, that's what's been going on. They got the lights on, most of them back on pretty quickly, precisely because this is back to they predicted it, because they knew it could happen soon. So they've been practicing what's called black restart drills, so that when it happened, that they could get the lights back on relatively quickly. And you got to give them credit for a couple of days. I think pretty much everybody's close to back up now, if I remember correctly from last night.
Yeah, but what's to say? I mean, if they don't change the underlying structure of the system, then they're going to be right. They're right back in the same place, right?
Right. They'll just be practicing that drill more often than just exactly. No, I would say if you're a technological optimist, as I am, you could say there are a variety of technology solutions to this. And that is not just more batteries, but smarter grids and more control systems. All that's true. But all of it takes time, a long time, and costs money. And what we know for, as I said, 150 years of grids in the world is that there are ways in which you can keep them reliable. And too much wind and solar is not one of them. This is a relearning of the trifecta of grids. Consumers and businesses expect three things from the grid, because everyone knows why it's important. It should work all the time, which is a really tough standard. It should always be on, because whether it's computers or cell phones or medical equipment, has to always be on. I need enough for growth and it needs to be cheap. And those are the sort of the three sacrosanct things in electric supply. They've all been subsumed to the idol of pushing more wind and solar on grids without regard to damaging all three. And it damages all three of those things.
There was some talk that this could have been a lot worse than it was, and I don't pretend to understand how interconnected the grids are in Western Europe, but that this could have extended beyond Spain and Portugal and part of France, just based on the power that was being generated, and I guess something related to the interconnectedness.
Yeah, well, as we go back to the analogies, which are not entirely accurate in the physics, but they're helpful analogies. You think of it as like a rogue wave on the ocean. If it cascades and you don't have a breakwater, or you can't disconnect. If you have these massive disruptions in the grid, loss of power, it's sort of the inverse of like a lightning strike, right? It's this massive disruption. You have to isolate. It flows and echoes down the other transmission lines. The other transmission line operators need to isolate themselves, disconnect from that before it washes overboard into their grid, which they did, by the way, and successfully. But you have to do it very quickly. You don't have a lot of warning. These things happen fast. This is what happened, by the way, almost exactly 60 years ago. The 1965 outage, ironically, that took out all the northeast of the United States, happened long enough ago that pretty much everybody's listening doesn't remember it, wasn't alive. But it was an iconic and searing outage for the electric system, which was considered very modern at the time. And what happened there is that the succeeding parts of the grids were not able to quickly isolate themselves. They didn't move fast enough. And it was what they learned in the forensics, and that took the outage from Chicago to New York. The whole Northeast went black, and it was black, I think, if I recall correctly, for days. And it happened in the summer. It was hot. A lot of bad stuff happens. So it was an epic, tragic outage, and that caused the formation of what we now have, which is a North American Electric Reliability. It's called Council then, now Corporation, which every year monitors, sets standards for reliability. Europe doesn't have that. What they have instead is a European Council. I'll paraphrase it, to push wind and solar on the grids. I mean, that's not its title, but that's what their council is about. I will make a prediction that two things will happen. Politicians, as you pointed out at the outset, will blame the utility, blame the private sector, and then there'll also be a movement to create in Europe something like the U.S., North America has, which is a reliability council to set standards for reliability. I think the pressure from citizenry who have experienced this and not want to have it happen again will be politically overwhelming.
Well, can you, and I understand just from reading up on this that there was the issue was frequency, which is like the heartbeat of the grid, and so if the frequency drops too far, the patient dies. And so, but how can you? You can set all the standards you want if what you're doing doesn't match the physics, the reality of the physical world, and where we are technologically. Then you can set all the reliable standards you want, and you're not getting the system any more reliable. Amen, brother. As they say, you're singing my song. You can wave your pen, but you can't change the laws of physics. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So what has to happen is, and that's the problem we have in the United States. And the North American Electric Reliability Corporation not only sets standards that utilities are supposed to meet, but it also puts warnings out. But if politicians override them by the stroke of a pen, then obviously you can have bad things happen. So yes, you're right. The standards then have to be enforced or enforceable in the sense that the actions have to follow, which means you have to do things to keep the grid reliable. Your comment about frequency of the heartbeat of the grid, everybody knows it's called AC power, alternating current. So it alternates at a frequency. Here it's 60 cycles per second. In Europe it's 50, and that's what allows you to transmit power at great distances. By the way, the reason we have alternating current instead of what's called direct current. Your battery produces direct current and DC. But transmitting electricity over long distances is far, far easier. This is a Tesla discovery, not the car, but the guy, a long time ago. And it's a magical thing. It's a neat phenomenology, but it also is difficult to manage. It's the cheapest way, easiest way to put power for very long distances, but it has to be stable. And you're right. If you get a frequency variation that's too far, but it does a number of interesting things. It makes the grid quote unstable, but it also, because again of the physics of energy, it literally can light things on fire, light transformers on fire, destroy motors, ruin things. It's really quite remarkable. It's if you think about how waves break against the shore
and you just get the right physical conditions, you get really big waves. That's a frequency phenomena. In electricity, if the frequency phenomena, the equivalent of that, gets out of alignment, then the braking against the shore equivalent is lighting on fire equipment, destroying it. And so that's why frequency stability is important. And if it gets unstable, everything disconnects. You have circuit breakers that trip and things, because you don't want the generator destroyed. What happens is that the discontinuity, if you like, that wave crashing moves both directions. It moves upstream into the power plants, the generating plants. It can ruin the generators. And if that happens, you'll have outages for a long time because you have to replace the generators. So those trip off. So that's what happens, is that you get this disturbance, and it's not that there isn't enough power. It's that the generating plants themselves disconnect in order to prevent themselves from being harmed. And if what's being disconnected it can't restart, it doesn't have what's called black start, or if it doesn't have its own frequency stability, then everything just cascades. But you're right. I mean, let's see. The French are on, if I understand correctly, and there's going to be a lot of forensics on this. The French are on the bubble, as I say, of having it cascade into their country. I think your projection and prediction is right. There'll be a lot of blaming. What will happen is that we'll do technical forensics, and sometime in the coming months, long after the political firestorms died down, there will be a technical report, and it will point out what happened. And you're right when you're set up for our conversation that there'll be some exogenous event. It was probably not a solar event, quote unquote, but the grid couldn't handle it, and it wasn't able to handle it because of how they let the fragility of that grid evolve, because of forcing too much wind and solar on the grid. It's fixing it will be expensive, which will, by the way, make a lie of the fact that the sun is free.
Well, let's say that the politicians in Western Europe and in the states that are pursuing the same policies were solutionists instead of socialists, and you were brought in to advise them. What would you do? I mean, what should they do to their grids to change the distribution of power sources or change the infrastructure in some meaningful way? What should they do? What would they do if they were really trying to improve the triad you mentioned in terms of stability and affordability?
I like the construction. I may borrow it with credit. Solutionists instead of socialists.
Yeah, sure.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, free market versus. Well, the government has a role here. So but this is a delicate thing in governance and politics, right? What is the government's role? Is it to say we're smart, we know exactly what the solution is, and you should build more solar or more batteries or or just ordering more combustion turbines? The government solution is to make reliability prime by saying that. How would you do that? Well, you would say that when we are connecting new power plants to a grid, any grid, you have to meet our economic requirements. You put bids out if you like. We'll pay this much for more electricity, but only if it meets this other technical requirement, a reliability requirement, which is typically called dispatchability, which means I can get the power when I need it in these conditions, which of course is the frequency condition, if you like, or a stability condition. And if you do that at one tweak, then that will force the market, the technologists, the solutionists, to come up with solutions. And there are solutions, by the way, for wind and solar to meet those standards, but they're expensive. And then the market will find out as if those solutions from wind and solar are equal to or less or more expensive than adding more gas turbines or coal plants. If you make that prime, that directive, the prime directive in grids is, I need it when I need it, the grid has to stay reliable and cheap. If that's the prime directive, instead of what they've done, the engineers and the innovators and the utilities will meet the challenge and solve the problem. But what will happen is they'll say, oh, no, we didn't have enough wind and batteries, especially enough batteries, so we'll provide incentives and give money away and demand that be more batteries and more smart grids. They'll talk about requiring it to be easier and faster to shed load. In other words, if you lose some power and the thing gets unstable, I want to more quickly turn something off. Your lights, your building, your factory. You're going to hear a lot of that, but the right answer is to create we'll call it the safety standard, and let the market meet that standard the cheapest way possible, which incidentally is more or less what utilities have done for well over a century until we got derailed by this obsession to avoid burning hydrocarbons. And it is an obsession, and it did derail things.
Mark Mills is the founder and executive director of the National Center for Energy Analytics. Mark, thank you as always. Appreciate your insights.
Good to talk. Have a great day.
You too, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Your show keeps me alive during the week. There's nobody I'd rather listen to between 5 and 9 in the morning than you guys.
On AM 560, The Answer.
You heard the news. Newsmax just went public on the New York Stock Exchange and listed on the big board. Millions of Americans like you are joining our news revolution. Reuters Institute says Newsmax is one of the top 12 news brands in America. Even President Trump says it's